the negotiation is really intense. And there's one moment where I had to take a moment to calm down and collect myself because it was very, very funny, but it's right at the end. So I'll talk about that when we get there. In general, it's not the funniest episode leading up to that, but it is still brilliantly written. The Negotiation is the 18th episode of the 3rd season of The Office. This is directed by Jeffrey Blitz, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And I'll talk about the main narrative second, because partly that's where most of my thoughts are, but also I was so excited to see how that would unfold, and honestly, I am very excited about it still. I will first of all though talk about the story with Daryl and Michael and Toby, and it starts off with Daryl asking for a raise, and he happens to point out that Michael is wearing a woman's suit. And Michael asks everybody else, and especially Pam, to say it's not a woman's suit. Pam points out there are no pockets on the trousers, and that's how you know it's a woman's suit. So irritating. I think trousers made for women are getting better with pockets, but they're still not quite there. And Michael and Daryl are continuing to talk, and Daryl happens to point out that Michael barely makes more than Daryl does, which I have to say shouldn't be the case. There should be, well, I don't know actually, if Daryl's kind of quite high up in the warehouse, I'm not entirely sure where in the pecking order that compares with Michael. If he's the foreman and in charge of the warehouse, though, that seems like he should still have a pretty decent salary nonetheless, and he tells Michael that Michael should go for a raise. And I guess if Michael gets a raise, it makes it more likely that Daryl will, because that will widen the gap between their salaries, and maybe they're meant to be a little bit closer. So Michael thinks, yes, I should go and try and get more money, so he has to go and talk with Jan in person, but there has to be somebody else there. So he wants to take Daryl, but Jan says that he has to take Toby, and Michael tells Toby to come with him, and Toby asks where they're going, and Michael said, to smack you over the head with a hammer. And because in the cubicle beside Toby, Kelly and Rainn are currently arguing, well, it seems like Kelly is doing most of the talking. Toby realises getting smacked over the head with a hammer might be the better option. And off they go, and Michael talks with Jan, and, well, the conversation goes as one would expect. He tells her, you give me a good raise or no more sex, which is so inappropriate, and Toby is very busy writing all of this down for future use. Very, very wise decision to have Toby there. And ultimately what happens with this is something I'm concerned about as being a genuine thing. Because Jan tells Michael, I can give you a 12% raise, but you have to ask for 15. And of course there is the negotiation. And I'm genuinely concerned that that's how a lot of corporate companies operate, that whatever you ask for, they will give you but less. So in theory, if Michael had went, I want a 20% raise, which admittedly is quite a lot to ask for, would they have went, well, I'll give you 17? I feel like there is going to be a line drawn somewhere, but it just seems like no matter what a person asks for, they will never get it. They'll always get something less. And honestly, it's a little bit of a concern. So it's a good part of the narrative, really enjoyed it, definitely very thought-provoking. And then we come to the bit that I was most excited for, and I'll be honest, I was pleasantly surprised that they just jumped in straight away, because at the end of the previous episode, Roy mentioned that he was going to kill Jim. And I had thought that they would give us a couple of scenes of the subplot in this episode before bringing in that into the main narrative. But no, it starts off with a very sinister shot of the camera looking through the blinds down at Roy, who's kind of pacing in the parking lot. And within seconds, he is upstairs, he shouts Jim's name, and he lunges, he goes for him. And Dwight comes to his rescue. Dwight pepper sprays Roy and also everybody else around about him. And I have to say that that was really beautiful. I'm really glad that it was Dwight. I mean, it makes perfect sense that Dwight would be ready to become a superhero at a moment's notice, but I'm really glad that it was Dwight who basically saved Jim from being punched, and I rather liked that quite a lot, and quite frankly, so did Dwight. And Roy is fired, And it does make me wonder. I haven't looked ahead. I always try and avoid looking ahead with The Office because I like the excitement of not knowing what's around the corner. But with Roy fired, and then what happens a little later on with Roy and Pam, have we seen the end of Roy? I don't know. I don't want to know either, but I will find out in due course. And Pam says to Jim, sorry, I almost got you killed. And they're alone together. Jim's getting something from the vending machine. And she says to him, Jim, and for about a second, maybe this is me just reading into it what I want to see, but for about a second, it was like she was going to tell Jim how she really felt. Because she'd established she was no longer with Roy, and it really seemed like she was about to say, and I still love you, or something like that. Granted, actually, she's never really admitted how she feels to Jim. It's mostly been Jim doing all of the admitting. But I did for a split second. Maybe Pam thought that as well. And then she ultimately just ended up saying, I'm really sorry. Which I truly believe is how she feels. And much to his credit, Jim tries to buy Dwight a beer to say thank you. Jim doing anything to please Dwight and make Dwight happy is probably making Jim feel uncomfortable. But he realises just how great Dwight was in that moment. And Dwight compares himself to Han Solo. So Dwight realised how great Dwight was in that moment as well. Things get a little bit awkward when Roy comes back in. And he came back in for, I think, his notice or his last paycheck or something. And he apologises to Jim. I like the fact that we get to draw a line under that. He's apologised. Let's move on from it. And Roy asks Pam if they can meet for coffee. She hesitates. And I was really surprised in that moment, actually, that the camera didn't focus on Jim. Because when they were alone together in the room, Jim kind of said, well, he kind of implied that he was pretty sure Pam and Roy would get back together again at some point. And I'm really surprised that when Pam hesitated about meeting Roy for coffee, that it didn't focus on Jim. So that it seemed like Jim's concerns that they get back together were being realised. So I'm surprised about that. But then they do meet for coffee, and it's a pleasant enough conversation. They both admit to having made mistakes, and they hug and go their separate ways. And I hope and assume that that's that. Because Roy isn't good for Pam. And I also want to applaud that was a cross between applaud and praise the show for not dragging out Pam and Roy for too long. I was really annoyed when Pam decided to get back with Roy. And it only lasted a couple of episodes. And I'm really thankful for that. It kept us on our toes. And maybe it could have gone on for longer. But I'm happy with the way it's gone. But we'll see what happens in the future. And right at the end, well, there are two great things. One, Angela and Dwight end up making out in the office. Which is a big deal for Angela, actually, because Angela is very paranoid that somebody's going to find out. And Jim sees them through the window, and his expression was just fabulous. And he tells the camera, I will never say a word, and now we're even. I thought he knew. But then, because Pam knew, so I guess I just assumed that Jim would also know. But then, of course, there was that moment quite a few episodes ago when they were in the hotel and Jim went into Dwight's room. This was a spoiler, of course, for a few episodes back. And he thought it was a prostitute. But obviously, we, the viewer, knew it was Angela. And he didn't make the connection then. So maybe he didn't know. And that's quite interesting. I quite enjoyed that. And the ending, the final thing is the bit that honestly had me howling with laughter because I hadn't expected it. It came out of nowhere. And Dwight's just doing everybody a great service in this episode because Andy comes back and says, hey guys, guess who's back? And without missing a beat, without hesitation, Dwight pepper sprays Andy. Andy is so irritating. I think I like the character. I think I like what he brings to the show. I haven't always, but I think in his recent episodes before he disappeared for a bit, and I think I started to like what he brought to it, but I feel like everybody hates Andy. Everybody in the office dislikes Andy except for Andy. and for Dwight to do that was just a great service for everybody. And I didn't see it coming, and I rather enjoyed it. So it is a really solid episode. As I said, it's maybe not the funniest episode, but it's still very well done. Personal highlights would be the fact that they just launched straight away with Roy, because I was expecting them to hold it back for a couple of scenes, and they didn't. So I was rather pleased about that. Dwight jumping to Jim's rescue, whether he did it for Jim's sake or for Dwight's own sake to look like a hero, I think it's probably the latter. But either way, whatever his motivation, I really liked it. And obviously, the pepper spraying of Andy right at the end there. I think I missed Andy. If you'd asked me before, have I missed Andy? I probably would have said no. But then seeing him come back there, it's made me a little excited to have him around again. So that's an unexpected feeling as well. At this point, I have no idea what's around the corner. I have no idea what to expect from Pam and Jim. I hope we get some forward movement, just a little bit, just a tiny bit, because I feel like every time we inch forward, we're dragged backwards, and I need just a little something. Not too much. I'm not asking for a lot. Just something that seems like progress. But either way, the negotiation is a solid episode, and definitely one with some pretty amazing moments.